Hello, my name is Brennan Horton, and this week's workshop is focusing on study skills. This workshop is intended to help those who are both looking for long-term study skills on how to improve during your general schooling, as well as those looking to improve your performance for an upcoming exam or final. So the first thing I want to address is, what does it mean to study? How do we define studying? Well, the definition that I prefer is the one given by dictionary.com. It says, to apply oneself to the acquisition of knowledge, as by reading, investigation, or practice. So there's two kind of separate parts you want to break down. The first part says to apply oneself to the acquisition of knowledge. And that's important. What that means is that you want to try to acquire knowledge. You want to have knowledge that will come into your mind and that it will stay there. You don't want something that's going to come in and then leave the next day. The second thing is you can improve this through reading, investigation, or practice. And these are three of the primary methods by which one can study. And we'll go into a little more detail on each of those and some here in the next couple slides. The next thing I want to address is, how do we learn? This is kind of a fundamental question that helps to understand why we do certain things when we study. So first off, it's important to recognize that learning is a physical process within the brain. The brain is a physical part of your body. It's not some mind floating off in the ether. It's separate from your soul. Your brain is a physical component. Also, learning can kind of be split into short-term learning and long-term learning. Short-term learning is something that you learn and you remember for a few days and then you forget it. Long-term learning is when you learn something and it stays in your mind, and maybe 10 years later you don't remember it, but with a small review it comes back and you remember it like it was yesterday. Another thing to note is that since the brain is a physical part of your body, it requires nutrition and sleep to function properly. If you don't have the energy that you need to run your body, the brain, the most energy intensive part of the body, is it going to function correctly? Sleeping as well helps to regenerate the brain at night, so your brain suffers constant damage throughout the day. It's got wear and tear like any kind of muscle would. And then during the night when you sleep, that's the brain's repair process. So if you're not eating properly, you're not getting enough water, and you're not sleeping properly, it's going to affect your ability to learn. And finally, an important thing to know is that there are specific techniques that we can utilize that will help you to learn better. Now, obviously, as I've kind of alluded to, long-term learning is better. It's better to kind of build out a plan for how you want to study and learn than it is to try to cram at the last minute for your exam or for a quiz or just learning on your own even. So, what do we mean by long-term studying? Well, long-term studying kind of begins with a very basic concept, and that's just to show up to class. But in addition to showing up to class, you need to be present. And I don't mean physically present, I mean mentally present. If you're not awake and you don't have energy and you're in class, you might as well not even be there sometimes. So try to, and especially right now, like with COVID, right? You maybe want to sit up in your chair. Don't lay down in bed or on the couch during class. Don't have TV on in the background. Go into a quiet place and pay attention during class. Make it a concerted effort to pay attention. In addition to this, whenever your brain, right, when you're learning something, your brain has things called neurons. It's kind of like dots. You want to connect the dots, like a connect the dot puzzle, right? And whenever you learn something, what you do is you find the shortest path from point A to point B. And when you first learn something, you might take a zigzag path. But once you've kind of gotten a stronger understanding of something, that path from A to B is more direct. So, when we talk about interacting in class and asking questions, what that does is it strengthens your brain's bonds, your connections, so that you can more quickly get from point A to point B without having to spend a lot of rigor thinking about things. Another important thing, and it kind of ties back into that same thing, is that you need to take notes. Taking notes, again, can reduce that difficulty in moving from point A to point B, but in addition to being useful just to kind of strengthen your brain, it also helps you to recall the information later, which we'll talk about in more detail. And then finally, a general rule of thumb whenever you're studying is that you want to use, for every 1 hour that you spend in class, you want to spend 1 hour studying. And then finally here we have, whenever you set a schedule, that can help you to form general study habits. So the important thing here is you want to form habits so that it becomes more natural for you to begin studying in a long-term manner. Alright, so as I alluded to before, we want to now talk about what it means to take effective notes. So the first and maybe obvious thing is you need to write clearly. As I mentioned before, there's 2 points of taking notes. One point to taking notes is that it helps you to form better connections in your brain. But the second point is that you want to be able to look at it later. And if you don't write clearly so that you can read it, then there's going to be no point in looking back at them later. So write clearly so that you can understand your notes later. Another thing is you don't want to just copy everything. If you copy everything down, you're going to get too much information. You're going to wind up missing the important things, which kind of goes into the next point. You want to copy down or write down the general ideas and the important details. And if you feel like the professor's going too fast, feel free to ask the professor to slow down. A lot of the times, if you feel like the professor's going too fast, the classmates might feel like the same way. And you don't have to necessarily ask, hey, can you slow down? You can ask a question about something you're unsure about, or ask them to go back and explain something again. And then finally, this is maybe the most important thing I want you to take away from note-taking. You need to review your notes after class. If you're not reviewing your notes, you're losing half the point of taking notes. Alright, so the next thing we want to talk about is scheduling study time. So the most important thing with setting a schedule is that you need to find something that's consistent. So you need to set times that you can consistently and always meet. It's often best, in general, to try to study as soon as possible after your classes. You want to do it while it's fresh in your mind, but maybe you want to take a 5-minute break. Grab a snack, drink some water, do a couple stretches, 5-10 minutes, sit back down, study as soon as possible as you can after class. It's understandable if maybe you have work or if you have another class, but don't put it off until the weekend or even worse, right before your exam. Study as soon as possible because it'll still be fresh in your mind and you'll be able to recall the things that were unclear to you during class. The next thing is, as I mentioned before with that 5-10 minute break, you want to give yourself an appropriate amount of time for mental breaks. So 5 to 10 minutes in between classes, 5 to 10 minutes in between your studying. If you are studying for an hour, then you might want to take a 15-minute break after that and then study for another hour. So if you're studying for a long period of time, and I generally recommend studying in 20 to 30-minute intervals with 5-minute breaks in between. And then another good tip for studying long term is to study on the weekends. Now, I know for many of you, you don't have as much free time as you might have had earlier on in your life, but right now, when you have a weekend, that tends to be whenever you have a little more free time. So use that free time well to study. Another important reason that studying on the weekend is good is when you are relaxed, which you tend to be a little more relaxed on the weekends, uh, your brain processes new information better. So studying on the weekend is a really good idea. All right, the next thing we want to talk about is short-term studying. Sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes something happened and you didn't get to follow your long-term study plan, or maybe you just need to put a little extra time in to study for an exam that's coming up. So that's when we need short-term studying. Whenever you're performing short-term studying, maybe you've got a couple of different exams, it's important that you try to divide your time between all of your subjects. Don't spend all of your time on the hardest subject. You need to give some time to the easy subjects as well. It's also a good idea to generally start with the hardest subject when you're studying. Don't end on the hardest subject, because that'll be kind of a runaway issue where you'll say, oh, I'm going to study for an hour, and then you study for 3 or 4 or 5 hours, and then suddenly it's midnight or 2 a.m. and your exams in the morning and you're exhausted. So focus on the hardest subject first and give yourself a set amount of time, and then move on to the next thing. And yeah, as I said before, find a schedule and stick to it. So give yourself a set amount of time for each subject. And also, as I mentioned before, don't overdo it, because if you stay up till midnight or stay up till 2 a.m. studying, and if you got a morning exam, you're going to be tired and you're going to wind up doing worse on the test than if you hadn't studied at all. So another general tip for you is maybe 6 or 7 p.m. should be your cutoff if you have a morning exam. Don't study any later than that. Maybe watch a movie or play a game or something to kind of relax yourself before you go to sleep that night, before your morning exams. All right, the next thing we want to talk about is a study session. What does an effective study session look like? Well, the first thing is that you need to hydrate properly and bring snacks. As I mentioned before, the brain is a physical process, or it's a physical part of your body, and your brain needs more water than anything else in your body. Your brain is a spongy water mass, so it needs lots of water, and your brain is also the most energy-dependent part of your body. It uses more energy than the rest of your body, so you need to provide lots of energy in the form of nutrition and snacks. Next, you want to start off your study sessions by reviewing your notes. That means going back and looking at things, maybe redoing practice problems. So you want to rework examples from class, and you want to, again, as I said before, work on your practice problems. This is especially true in like math or science classes, but can also be true in an English type class. Maybe in like a history or literature class, you wouldn't have examples or practice problems, but you could reread the material or practice writing essays. As I mentioned earlier as well, you want to try to study in 20 to 30 minute intervals and give yourself 5 to 10 minute breaks in between. All right, the next thing I have to mention is study groups. Study groups are a popular way to study, but they are a double-edged sword. So the first and very important thing you need to know about study groups is that you should definitely study alone before you go to a study group. If you show up to a study group having not studied on your own first, you're going to drag everyone down around you. And the same can be said for your study partners. So you want to choose good study partners that you know are going to be responsible and study on their own before coming in to study together. You want to come prepared with questions and things that you don't understand so you can ask your classmates, because maybe you don't understand question 1, but they understand question 1, and they don't understand question 3, but you do, so you can kind of exchange that information. Don't meet the night before the test. This kind of goes back to something I mentioned earlier, but that whole idea of staying up too late studying becomes worse in a study group, because there's that peer kind of like, you've got the peer pressure from being around a group of people, and you wind up overdoing it a lot easier than if you were studying on your own. So don't meet the night before a test. The next thing is you want to try and find questions that you can ask the professor. So generally study groups, you want to meet well before the exam, like a week before the exam at the latest. That way you can ask questions a couple of days before your exam and try and get answers for them. Next, we want to talk about reviewing and what does it mean to effectively review. So, as I mentioned before, you want to review as soon as possible after class. When we talk about reviewing, we kind of break it down into three parts. First, you want to reread the information. So, reread your notes. Then you want to rewrite your notes. And when I say rewrite your notes, you want to make them cleaner, but you also want to organize them. So in some cases, it can be useful maybe to draw a table or a graph or to draw a picture to better express the big ideas that you wanted to learn when you were taking your notes. You will also want to use this time to fill in the gaps of the things that you didn't understand in class or that the professor didn't go over but told you would be on the test. And then finally, you want to rework, as I said before, you want to rework examples and reread the text. So for math and science and English, rework examples. For history and literature, you want to reread the texts. So this is a very common way of thinking amongst a lot of students. They learn material, they take the test, they pass the test, and then they forget it. This goes completely against the entire idea of learning. It defeats the purpose of education totally. So we want to try to avoid this mindset and focus on good long-term learning strategies. In order to kind of give you a better idea of why it's bad to memorize, we're going to compare memorization with long-term learning. So memorization is the process of committing raw information to your brain. So this is commonly done in maybe like a history class. You might remember a date that something happened on. You might remember the specific name of a historical figure. Now, these are important things sometimes whenever you're writing like a historical essay. However, most of the time what you want to focus on is the big ideas. So learning or long-term learning is learning how learning the information and then how it can be used. So it takes it a step further. It's giving you a deeper understanding so that you can then make speculative analysis based on information. The next thing with memorization is this occurs by force of will. You just read a sentence over and over again, or you write sentences, or you look at flashcards until you remember something. But doing it this way will cause it to leave your mind after some time. Learning, on the other hand, or long-term learning, occurs by practice and reflection. So with math and science, you're doing practice problems. With history and literature, it's reflection by writing essays. Memorization is really, as I mentioned before, only good for the short term, whereas long-term learning is meant to last longer. It's something that will stick with you for years, and if you forget it, you only need to review for a few minutes and it comes back to you. Memorization is really bad for problem solving, so it's completely unusable in math and science and physics and those types of classes that are heavy in problem solving. Learning or long-term learning, on the other hand, is very good for these math and science classes. So if you've ever wondered why you struggle with math and science, but you're good with literature and history, it might just be because of the way you're studying. It might be that you're not doing enough practice problems. You're not doing enough long-term learning strategies. Another important thing about memorization is that it's good for details. As I mentioned earlier with like history, if you need to learn a date or specific historical figure, memorization can be useful. However, most of the time when you're writing that type of essay, you're not going to be in a classroom setting. You'll have a couple of weeks and you'll be researching and doing all of that on your own time. In which case there's no point in memorizing. You're just going to refer to your information. And finally, with learning, as I mentioned before, it's necessary for STEM. So that's science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as writing whenever you want to write like a longer essay. All right. The next thing we want to talk about is sometimes, as I mentioned before, you can't help it. You've only got a couple of days before your exam. Something happens. Whatever the case, you need to memorize some things. So let's talk about memorization techniques. I mentioned earlier one of the most powerful ways to perform memorization is to use flashcards. Flashcards are really good for definitions. So you can write, maybe on you're trying to learn the state capitals. So on one side you write the state, and on the other side you write the capital. And that's kind of an effective way to memorize information for the short term. Another common strategy is to practice these kind of memorization techniques, whether you're writing down sentences or whether you're using flashcards. Practice in sets of 8 or less. It's kind of a trick of the mind, and it's not an exact science, but the human brain has an easier time, for the average person, of understanding 8 or less items at a time. And this also helps you to group this information. So you want to try and get your information into meaningful groups, because if you have them in meaningful groups, if you forget one item, you might remember another one by relation to that first item. So split up your information into meaningful groups, make flashcards of groups of 8 or less, and memorization will go a lot smoother. Another important thing is that sometimes it's easy to just write information or draw a picture, and that can help you memorize things. So it's not necessarily always useful or ideal to use flashcards, so this can be a useful alternative. Alright, so now let's talk about practice problems. In math, science, and writing, all of these skills require practice. This means that you need to review examples to understand the core concepts that you discuss in your classes. Then you need to repeat those practice problems until they become natural. Once you've kind of got the hang of things, then you want to create or find harder versions of the same problems to test yourself to make sure you really understand the fundamental concept. Alright, so finally let's talk about exams. So what do we do before the exam? Well, as I've mentioned a couple times already, do not study the night before the exam. Relax instead. If it's the night before the exam, it's too late. You don't need to study anymore. If you study at 6 p.m. the night before a morning exam, you're going to wind up doing worse than if you hadn't studied at all. So just relax, sleep well, eat well in the next morning. So you want to turn off your electronics and make sure you get a full night of sleep. And in the morning, you want to make sure you're well hydrated. You eat a light meal. You don't want to eat something too heavy that's going to make you drowsy during your exam. And you want to, if you have a workout routine, stick with your normal workout, because it'll make you feel sluggish if you don't. And finally, show up early, prepared just in case something goes wrong. That way, maybe if you forget your calculator, you can quickly go back or find some way to borrow a calculator so that you have that for your exam. The next thing we want to talk about is taking the exam. So when you're taking an exam, you want to focus on answering the easy questions first. So what you want to do is you want to skim through the entire exam. If you've got an hour, maybe spend 2-3 minutes just skimming through the exam, not reading all the problems, just skimming through and kind of getting an idea for what types of problems you have. Then find the ones that look like they're going to be the easiest and start on them first, because you'll get them out of the way quickly. You can focus more time on the hard problems. If you get stuck, skip the problem and come back to it later. Don't spend 20 minutes on one problem when you've got 20 problems to solve and only an hour to do the exam. Never leave a free response question blank. If you have an exam that has free response questions, you would be surprised what professors are sometimes willing to give you partial credit for. If you can't think of something, just write something. Maybe you might get 2 points out of 20, but those 2 points, they do add up over time. Finally, you want to make an educated guess if you have multiple choice questions. So that means if you have 4 answer choices, and you know answer choice A and D are wrong, and you're down to B and C, choose the answer that makes the most sense out of the two. If you can eliminate 2 choices, you got a 50-50 chance, which is a lot better than a 1 out of 4 chance. And finally, just remember, relax and do your best. At this point, it's too late to study. You can't learn new information. Just do what you can and move on. And that's everything I wanted to talk about today. I hope you all learned something, and we'll see you for the next workshop.